Well, welcome. My name's Susan Elliott, and I'm the President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And we're very pleased to have you here today to participate in our discussion about U.S. policy toward the African nations and African continent. And we have a really distinguished panel of experts, not only experts on U.S. African relations, but I think among the three of them, they've served in every region around the world. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started on the discussion. We will have a little discussion among ourselves, and then we'll open the floor up to questions. So please feel free, as you have a question, to put it in, type it into the Q&A function on this Zoom conference. So I'd like to start first with Ambassador Herman J. Cohen, who is the president and CEO of Cohen Woods International. He had a very distinguished career as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, and his last assignment was as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, as well as U.S. Ambassador to Senegal, and served in a variety of African countries, served in Washington and in France. And he's the author of a recently published book, U.S. Policy Toward Africa, 8 Decades of Realpolitik. So I highly recommend that to our participants. We're going to have a little discussion about Ambassador Cohen's book during the presentation. We also have Ambassador Harry K. Thomas Jr. Ambassador Thomas is a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson School Institute for Global Affairs, and he's a senior strategic engagement leader at the Special Operations Command. So I think he goes back and forth between New Haven and Tampa, and we're very pleased that he could spend some time with us today. He also had a very distinguished foreign service career, serving as U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe, U.S. Ambassador to the Philippines, and U.S. Ambassador to Bangladesh, as well as having many high-level positions at the State Department, one in which I worked for him when he was Executive Secretary during the administration of Secretary Condoleezza Rice. And we also have Ambassador Bisa Williams. Bisa had a very distinguished career in the Foreign Service, as did Harry and Hank, and she is now serving as the co-founder and managing director of Williams Strategy Advisors. It's a problem-solving in business and foreign affairs advisory consulting firm. But over the last 2 years, she has led the Carter Center's effort as an independent observer for the implementation of the peace agreement in Mali. So we're very interested in hearing her thoughts on what's going on there. She also was a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, serving more than 30 years in many different countries, and also serving as U.S. Ambassador to Niger. So we are very pleased to have all three of you here today. And I'd like to start our discussion with you, Ambassador Cohen, because I think I was very pleased in reading your book to kind of get a really good overview of, how U.S. policy toward Africa has evolved since the end of World War II. And, sometimes I think, and wrongfully, there's this notion that American policy vis-a-vis the African nations has been deemed ineffective or far removed from principal policymakers. And I think your book, which I highly recommend to our viewers, and we will give you how you can order it, either electronically or in hardcover. I think your book really, at least to me, pointed out, how this debate about our policy in Africa has reached, the highest levels of the U.S. government, from the White House to the Secretary of State and on down. So I wonder, Ambassador Cohen, if you might start out, just give us a little overview of your book and your thoughts on where U.S. policy has been and where we might be going at the present time.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, for this very nice introduction and for organizing this panel. And I greet my fellow panelists also. The United States really became interested in Africa during the Second World War for two reasons. We needed the uranium from what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo to produce our nuclear weapon. And we even sent troops to the Congo to maintain the mines and to make sure there was no interference. And also, we needed Africa as a transit to get our troops and equipment through to the Middle East and to the Far East. I have in my records, I have a letter from my brother who was an army private, and he was going from Louisiana to India to be stationed. And he sent us a letter from Accra, which was then in the Gold Coast. And we were building airfields and improving airfields. So the Second World War, we took a lively interest. So it was natural after the war that we should continue this interest. And I would say that thanks to the Republican Secretary of State, whose name was John Foster Dulles at the time, we really pushed the Europeans to bring African countries to independence. They were reluctant. I've seen lots of memorandum of conversation, where the British ambassador and the French ambassador were coming to the State Department saying, stop pushing us to bring our African colonies to independence. We need their resources. We're rebuilding after the war. But we kept pushing them. So toward the early 50s, the Europeans got the message and they started to prepare for independence. And I must give a lot of credit to President Eisenhower at the time, who said, well, if we're getting all these African countries to be independent, let's start making policy about it. And I've seen transcripts of National Security Council meetings that he presided over, where he had a debate. Well, what should our policy be? And we were in the Cold War by then. And Secretary of State Dulles said, Cold War is the thing. We got to go to each independent African country, say, you're with us or you're against us. But he was debated by Vice President Richard Nixon, who said, no, this is a big mistake. The newly independent African countries do not want to belong to any bloc. They want to be neutral. They want economic development. So let's leave the Cold War out. And President Eisenhower decided we will leave the Cold War out. So I reached the conclusion that many people who talk about US policy toward Africa inevitably say, of course, during the Cold War, that was the most important element in our policy. And my response is absolutely wrong. We did our best to leave the Cold War out of US policy toward Africa. Okay, so if our policy was not directed by the Cold War, what was the main thrust of our policy? And it was economic development. I remember my first post in Africa, I was in Uganda in early 1962, and I received an instruction, be prepared for the arrival of 10 families from USAID, because we're really going to push economic development. And this was true all over Africa. And I would describe our work in economic development as experimental. We really didn't have any experience with underdeveloped countries. The Marshall Plan was great because we were dealing with countries that had experience with industrialization, with infrastructure, with good agriculture. But the Africans were starting from scratch, and they also handicapped themselves because at the time, they were getting advice from the British Labour Party and the French Socialist Party. And in UK and in France during the 50s, the governments were nationalizing enterprises. I remember going to France in my first assignment, and I was looking for a bank to start an account, and all the big banks were government owned. Renault automobile manufacturing was government owned, and the same thing was in the UK. So the advice they gave to the Africans was nationalize the enterprises. Now, you can nationalize enterprises can also be run to make a profit and for reinvestment and for growth. But unfortunately, the Africans nationalized enterprises, plantations, factories, insurance company, banks, but they made them into employment factories. They hired lots of people, far more people than they needed for political purposes. And I remember Air Uganda, which had 3 planes. It was an excellent airline, and I flew all over East Africa in it, but they had 5,000 employees. And this was true throughout African countries that had nationalized enterprises. So these enterprises needed subsidies, which took money away from healthcare, from infrastructure, from education, that sort of thing. So the Africans started out with a big handicap. And so I say the United States experimented. We had different policies with different administrations. For example, and by the way, the US Congress was looking at this and saying, look, we're spending all this money on aid. We're not getting too many results, especially Senator Helms, who said, of South Carolina, who said that's money down a rat hole. Okay, so President Nixon, he decided to have concentration countries. Let's not give aid to all countries. Let's give aid to countries that are more likely to succeed. You know, the bigger ones, the Congo, Cameroon, Mozambique, etc. And that lasted and didn't get too many results. And the Clinton administration came in and said, well, if we're not going to succeed in aiding governments, let's aid the people. So he started a program called Basic Human Needs. Let's try to help the people. And at that time, I was US ambassador in Senegal, and we said, well, how could we implement this? So we decided to drill 500 water wells throughout the country so that the villagers could use that water to grow vegetables and sell vegetables, that sort of thing. And we also set up what we call health huts, which was a 3-person operation designed to help villagers get rid of standing water, to help them with infant diarrhea and that sort of thing. And that was a program, I think, that was quite successful throughout Africa. But still, it was not economic development. It was good for ordinary people. So we were constantly trying to experiment. I would say we only became creative in, by the way, during the time I was assistant secretary, we started spending money on democracy and on private sector development. But I think by the time we became creative in the Clinton administration with the development of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Send all of the things you can make to the United States duty-free, and this will encourage investment. And then in the Bush administration, you had PEPFAR to help people with HIV, and we're still spending a lot of money keeping people from dying from HIV. And he also started the very creative Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is, let's find those countries that are really ripe for development and put a lot of money into them. And I think this has been very successful. And then Obama had 2 important programs called Power Africa and Feed the Future. And this is where I had a lot of personal experience. I was helping a US company called Contour Global invest in private power in Africa. And they now have 5 private power plants making money in Africa. And thanks to Obama's Power Africa, they were able to get easy financing from OPEC, which is now the Development Finance Corporation. So those were very creative programs, but yet it's hard to see African countries with great progress in poverty reduction. And that is the eventual objective of economic development. And at the end, I'll talk about why I think this is the problem. There was also the challenge of minority rule in Southern Africa. How do we get those countries to move toward democracy? And there I have to give a great deal of credit to Secretary of State Kissinger. He saw that the more the South African apartheid government was engaging in repression to stay in power, the more it was going to be a domestic problem in the United States. So he said, he had a meeting with John Forster in Geneva, who was then the president of South Africa. And he said, look, things are really getting bad. You guys are beating up on Africans who are demonstrating. There's going to be a blow up in the United States about this. So you should go to Southern Rhodesia, talk to Ian Smith, the head of the white government there, and persuade him to move toward Black majority rule. This will take the pressure off you for a few years. eventually there'll be pressure on you, but to get rid of the pressure now. And John Forster did that. And because of his pressure on Ian Smith, the head of Southern Rhodesia, Rhodesia became a majority rule in 1980 or late 1979. And this eventually led to the end of apartheid. So I would give Henry Kissinger a lot of credit for starting that. And of course, the Carter administration continued the work, and they enacted, they got UN Resolution 435, which called for Namibia to become independent of South Africa. So the US played a major role, I think, in ending white minority rule in Southern Africa. Okay, now what about the Trump administration? The Trump administration I call continuity. There hasn't been much change, and I think the policy has been quite constructive. The one policy statement that was made on Africa by the Trump administration was done by former National Security Advisor John Bolton. And he made a speech saying, our big problem in Africa is China. China is doing a lot in infrastructure, in private investments, and they're all over Africa, and it's competition for us. And their influence is growing, so what can we do? And our way of doing it will be to encourage American companies to invest. And this started a program called Prosper Africa with a budget, with a bureaucracy in USAID, looking to encourage American companies to invest in profit making in Africa. I haven't seen too many results yet, but I think it's a good program because it provides very good financing opportunities through US government agencies. And of course, one can say, well, since President Trump takes delight in reversing everything that President Obama did, why didn't he do it here? Well, I don't know why, but the current administration is continuing all of the good work programs done by previous administrations. During Obama's last year, I managed to get into his summit conference that he had with African heads of state. I was there as a guest of a US private company that was invited. And President Obama really laid into the Africans. He says, you gotta stop corruption. You gotta stop nepotism. He says, you're not gonna get anywhere. I really was very impressed with him. And I don't think any other, of course, this was done privately. It didn't get into the press, but I really was impressed with the way he really pushed it. Okay, now China is very big. Now, how do I see China? I do not see China as a problem for the US. I see it as a problem for Africans to manage. There are good things that China is doing, investing in mining, investing in manufacturing, giving loans to Africans to do infrastructure. And I've seen some of the good work that's been done. Okay, now what are the problems that China is creating? First of all, they do not bring Africans into management in their companies. Unlike the Americans or the Europeans, for example, if you go to Chevron, Angola, one of the biggest oil companies in Africa, Chevron, Nigeria, one of the biggest oil companies in Africa, and you say, I want to see the director general. Okay, go in there. He's Nigerian. No, he wasn't placed there because he was politically connected. He has a 35-year career in Chevron. He's been all over the world. He was the right guy to run Chevron Nigeria. You don't see any of that with the Chinese. They do not bring people into management. Also, they treat the African workers badly. I was teaching at Johns Hopkins for a while, and I had a student who went to Africa to study the Chinese. And she went to one factory and she asked the Chinese manager, why are the workers being treated so poorly? He said, well, we treat them just like we do in China. We're not doing any different from the way I treat our Chinese workers. Also, when a project is finished in Africa by the Chinese, a lot of the workers do not go home. They go into the rural areas and they start retail. and they import a lot of Chinese goods, which undercuts any effort to start manufacturing in Africa. If you go to Kano, Nigeria, which used to be one of the main manufacturing towns of Nigeria, a lot of the industries have closed because of imported cheap Chinese goods. So I would say China is not a problem for the United States so much. It's a problem for Africans, and they have to manage it. And they have to do a much better job of managing it. So let me stop there, and I'll be very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Cohen. And I think I'm glad you pointed out at the end about, what the current, Trump administration is doing and has proposed to do for Africa. Because I think, when we discuss our concerns about China, I always say to myself, well, what is our alternative, to the Belt and Road initiatives and other things? So I think, continuing to stay engaged, and I think your idea of making sure that the Africans know how to manage the Chinese is extremely important. But I want to turn now, because you talked about economic development, and maybe to Ambassador Thomas to talk a little bit about his assessment of what the current COVID-19 pandemic has done to the African continent. I don't think we hear as much about that. We're so inwardly focused on what's happening in our own country. But I know when he was ambassador to Zimbabwe, there was the pandemic related to the Ebola virus, and I just have your thoughts on, perhaps what's going on now in relation to COVID in Africa, and are there things that we, in terms of U.S. policy, can do to try to assist the Africans with the pandemic?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Elliott, and good morning to my former boss, Ambassador Cohen, and my longtime colleague, Ambassador Williams. Thank you for having me this morning. Before I turn to COVID, I would like to make the point that much of U.S. aid to Africa, or developmental aid around the world, has not been meant to improve nations' economy. It has been directed at health or crises. So when we are working on COVID-19, or in the past, cyclones in Zimbabwe, or the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, it has been meant to save lives in a short term or a long term and not do economic development. So I think a lot of times Americans are dismayed that the countries that we're giving aid to have not developed economically in a way we would like to see, which is understandable. But I want our audience to understand that our aid in terms of saving lives, particularly in terms of President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief that began under President Bush and continued under President Obama and President Trump, has been a lifesaver and changer for Africa. It's a great success, and many of our programs in terms of anthrax, cholera, have been like that. And again, we are the world's #1 donor, and that does not take into account private charitable contributions, university contributions, which far outweigh any other nation assistance. Now, if I can turn to COVID-19, I would like to say that when we had the Ebola outbreak in Africa, the name itself led to much fear in the United States and clamping down. It was almost like it was an old colonial time movie, Ebola. People were frightened, which was unfortunate. That virus has not gone away. But what President Obama and Secretary Clinton did was deploy the 101st Airborne European Command, work with Congress to help limit this disease, work with other militaries. I think that all of our panelists recall our very good friend, Ambassador Deborah Malik, who was in Liberia, who really took charge of a lot of this in Liberia and later on when she was in the Congo. So I think we have to remember that one of the best things the United States military does is logistics.
Mm-hmm.
We are great at logistics, and using the U.S. military to do the logistics freed CDC, World Health Organization, other UN organizations to focus on limiting the spread and healing. That is not being done under COVID-19. Also, we have fabulous surgeons who are active duty military as well as reserve military. For example, if you look at Wake Hospital in Raleigh, who are doing a tremendous job, and despite the outbreak, we have two former Navy Surgeon Generals who work there, Rear Admiral and the Vice Admiral, with the Wake Hospital, and they're able to bring back to the military what they are doing, and not only for the military to protect our troops, but also maybe one day to work overseas in protection and eradication. So I am disappointed that President Trump has not done as his predecessors did in terms of Ebola and SARS and mobilize the world using the unique assets of the United States military in a non-lethal manner to combat COVID. Because when and if a vaccine comes, and we don't know when that will be and how that will be, Africa will be last. You're going to have to purchase this. Once you leave South Africa and maybe Nigeria and Kenya, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa are aid dependent and will not be able to purchase. So they're going to have to depend on WHO, whose funding we have cut, other UN agencies like UNICEF, whose funding we have cut, and if President Trump is reelected, for perhaps non-deployment of the U.S. military to get this. And we know that this pandemic, not only is it not our last, the borders cannot control it. So I would hope that in the future, President Trump or a possible President Biden would mobilize the international community, as been done in the past, for donations and assistance, not only to Africa, but other developing countries, and have our military work with other militaries on logistics to help these countries. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ambassador Thomas. And I do think that even though you make great points about the U.S. military and what the U.S. European Command, U.S. African Command could do, and I think as we look to the future, rather than look at what we haven't done, I think your point about looking for ways that perhaps when a vaccine is found, that we can make sure that all countries of the world, especially the countries of the African continent, have access to and are able to, get the vaccine in a timely manner. One of the things that Ambassador Cohen brought out in his overview of his book is not only, economic and health and development, but also I know that we at the U.S. government have been very interested in the formation of democracy. And so I'm very interested in hearing from you, Ambassador Williams, about what the Carter Center and you've done in terms of looking at the peace agreement in Mali. We know there's been a military coup there, and we know it's been unstable. And what kinds of things have you been doing, or do you think the U.S. government should do, or the private sector, in ensuring that there are democratic principles in the countries of Africa?
Thank you. It's good again to be with you, Susan. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this, and hello also to my former Assistant Secretary Hank Cohen and to my dear friend Ambassador Harry Thomas. It's good to be on this panel with you. Yes, Mali. Mali is at a really delicate period in its evolution. I don't think that it is reflective of everything that's going on in the Sahel, but it's got several of the promises as well as several of the main problems happening in the Sahel, I'd say. For the Carter Center, I have been leading a project that they were invited to participate in, really, which had to do with the implementation of the peace agreement. Mali suffered a rebellion in 2012. There was a peace accord that was signed in 2015. And from 2015 through now, the country has been trying to implement that peace accord. Written into the accord was the idea that there would be an independent observer, which in fact I think is a first for African peace accords. I think it's a first for peace accords in general, but I can speak for the continent on that level, in that the rebellion was so intense. It was not the first time the North had tried to rebel from the rest of the government. And the distrust was such that both sides wanted to have an independent party to say, to make sure that everyone was meeting their requirements, their obligations. So in a way, it was a great affirmation for transparency and accountability, something that we often criticize African countries about. But there, the Africans themselves were saying, we are going to demand accountability for the implementation of this peace agreement, which I think is really important, an important note, because it also is linked to what we're seeing in the continuing unrest that you see in Mali now. But at any rate, we're 5 years down the road, and actually the peace agreement has not been well implemented. One of the major obstacles, I would say, we published an article about this recently in Foreign Affairs magazine, but one of the major obstacles has been the fact that there hasn't been demobilization of the former rebels. There has not been a movement into making a new national military. And part of the rallying cry for Mali's military was that we need to be able to secure the entire nation. Terrorists are coming in from outside of the continent, outside of the country. There are rebels in the north. We need to be represented all over. And the people in the north are saying, yeah, you can be represented all over, but we need to be represented in this military. Rather than take that leadership opportunity, the military resisted, the rebels bided their time, and there hasn't really been any forward movement on DDR, which is a problem. The current coup that you see in Mali, or that occurred in Mali, really was fueled by popular anxiety. Civil society had said, look, our political elite are not responding to us. Our elected government is dysfunctional. And the military, I guess, was relied on to say, okay, we're going to reestablish order. But that's still the wrong message. Mali is not the signal of how democracy needs to go in the Sahel. We have plenty of other countries in the Sahel that over the last 10 years have had elections. You can name Nigeria, you can name Burkina, Benin. You can just go across the entire Sahel, even all the way over to almost. You have to stop at Eritrea. But what we're seeing with even they're having elections, it's the institutions of governance that aren't strong enough. Accountability, judiciaries, people don't know if they're going to be able to obtain justice. There's not enough transparency. They're not going to have, if they'll have access to having their grievances addressed. So while I do think we are seeing right now, there is a discussion in Mali specifically between civil society and this transitional government, the CNSP, about how they're going to manage the next 12 to 18 months. Actually today, the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, is supposed to respond to what the coup leaders actually have proposed as a way forward. But I really think Mali is an isolated case. The government was really so dysfunctional over the last 2 years that it couldn't be relied upon on anything. Central Mali has been burning. Not only is there terrorist intervention, but there's interethnic conflict, which was not being addressed. And there's illiteracy, there are no jobs. There simply was a lack of government all over the place. If you put that, if you look at that and compare it to what we're seeing in Burkina Faso, what you see right in neighboring Niger, what you see in Benin, even in Mauritania, where you have had terrorist incursions in each of those places, but you also have a civil society that is active, engaged, and in actually holding its elected government to better accountability than they were able to do in Mali. I think that's very, very promising. Even in Sudan, where you've had a popular uprising, which is a major country in the Sahel, you have now civil society also working with, understanding that it's got to work with the military to try to figure out what are the roles that we're all going to play. The Carter Center has also been invited into Sudan to help provide that accountability structure where civil society, youth, and women, 60% of that uprising were really youth and women in Sudan. And now they are working together with military and with other segments of their society in Sudan to sort of slowly work their way forward in a democratic fashion. So the international community needs to support those kinds of efforts. The counterterrorism effort has taken a lot of attention, and it has almost, it has shifted the scales. National governments in Niger, where I was ambassador, I was told at one point they're spending 30% of their national budget on security, which means, of course, that comes at the expense of the other services that governments are expected to provide for their people. The international community is focused on the counterterrorism, on preventing the spread of it and preventing the influence of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS in these countries, has been partially effective in thwarting some of the terrorists, but has also been counterproductive because it has sent a mixed message to some of the militaries. Certainly in Mali's instance, it sent a mixed message. They cannot be the only force for development of the country. There's got to be education. There's got to be an injection of capital, and there's got to be economic development. There have to be jobs and livelihoods for people. All of those things have sort of been put on hold. So that's sort of that's part of my answer on the counterterrorism versus Mali versus democratization in the Sahel. I actually think you are seeing an engaged civil society in the countries of the Sahel, which is very, very positive. I think the international community has got to figure out how to better support that engaged civil society in strengthening democratic institutions, but also getting back to a more robust way of helping economies, helping economic growth, and helping the private sector and a middle class really form in these countries.
Well, you know, Ambassador Williams, I think I'm actually very encouraged to hear what you say, because even though it's not a great picture in Mali, you know, the surrounding countries look like they have made progress toward democratization. And I'm wondering, and this goes along with a question we had, and it was for Ambassador Thomas, but maybe it start out with you, you know, talks about U.S. African Command. And would you say that the U.S. military has played a positive role? I know that we've been focused on counterterrorism, but in trying to have a positive effect on the military in Mali, is there a good relationship there, and is it something that we can continue to develop?
Yes, we've had we try to play a positive role. We've actually in Mali let the French take the lead with the military relationship, although we do have programs in Mali, we have programs in the countries across the Sahel. The U.S. military motto had basically been with African militaries and through African militaries, we weren't going to just be directly engaging ourselves in a counterterrorism struggle. I think one of our best efforts has been in training African militaries on how to do counterterrorism themselves, creating Delta forces, their own special operations forces, and teaching them our own strategies on surveillance, on interpreting patterns of life, on identifying vulnerabilities. I think there we have done an excellent job, and I think we're recognized as such. Yes, we share space with local militaries. For example, in Niger, we share a Nigerian base. It's Niger's base, it's not ours. We're there at their permission, with their coordination. All that is excellent. I think, however, again, if the focus is only on the kinetic aspect of countering violent extremism and of the counterterrorism war, then we're missing an important element that has to do with who's in your military. In a lot of these militaries, you have segregated militaries, or you have minority, one sole ethnic group that really commands everything. So you have a microcosm of what might be happening in the country. We, as an American force, can really teach a lot about how to better integrate the forces and how the military has got to serve local communities differently. And that's what we've started to do in the Sahel. But we've got to, I believe that our military footprint has got to be accompanied by an economic and a judicial one.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I do think that our military, and I know that the U.S. African Command was formed to be able to train and to advise African military. This goes along with, and since we know that Ambassador Thomas talked about the importance of the U.S. military in Africa, there's a question from one of our participants, Nicholas Sung, who asked, what do you think, Ambassador Thomas, about AFRICOM potentially being relocated from Germany to Africa? He cites a report that was in the Washington Post a few days ago, and what would the policy implications be for that? I think it's a good question, and I think having served at the U.S. European Command, one thing most Americans don't realize is those are really the only two commands that are located outside the United States. But what do you think, Ambassador Thomas? Do you think that would make a difference in terms of our ability to deal with pandemics and other kinds of problems in the African continent? And where would you put it?
I'd keep it in Germany. I think it would cause too much disruption, false challenges, and a huge financial cost. Recall that we already have a base in Djibouti.
Right.
Yeah.
That we train in other places. Even our paratroopers train 82nd Airborne with the South African Airborne. We can train many places. The other thing the military has that I wish state and AID had was a huge civil affairs budget, where they are able to work with civil affairs projects that mirror some of the things that operation does in terms of bridges and roads, as well as this is not just done in Africa, but we use our reservist doctors and dentists to help treat people in everything from giving people prescription lenses to the thing that really matters in Africa, to different countries every couple of years. In many places the capital is the wealth, and they're able to work with the few local veterinarians and help the communities. So there are many things that the military can do. One of the things we notice that at Special Operations Command, yes, the focus is on counterterrorism and then civil affairs, but we work on cybersecurity. We work on new currencies such as Bitcoin and the others, human trafficking, sexual and as well as labor. So those are things that we can and should continue to work with African nations. And it, again, I wish it wasn't just, not just the military, but I wish we had that budget in state and AID to do those things as well as messaging. So those are some of the things the Special Operations Command is doing, along with conventional forces in AFRICOM to help African nations.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. And I, having served at the U.S. European Command, one of the things I didn't realize before I was there is that, you know, that the U.S. African Command and the U.S. European Command share resources. So to move the U.S. African Command to a different place, I think would make it more difficult for them to achieve their mission. But we have another, we've got several questions. So I want to move on to another one, which I think is extremely important, and maybe it's to all the panelists, but maybe I'll put it to Ambassador Cohen because he mentions this in his book. But it's from Thomas Butler, and he said, studies have shown that corruption is the single biggest impediment to economic development in emerging economies. And I've seen that in countries that I've served in, not just in the African nation. And we were very pleased to hear what you said about what President Obama said, but could you give some examples of policy levers that have perhaps been used or applied in Africa to try to change behaviors, and have they had, you know, an impact? So I give that to you, Ambassador Cohen, and then Ambassador Williams or, you know, Ambassador Thomas, if you want to chime in, please do.
Yes, I think corruption is a major issue. I phrase it not so much as corruption, but diversion of state resources to special interests. And it's mainly to political parties and elites in the ruling political parties who divert state resources. In East Asia, we have it all over the place, but in East Asia, it's kept down. But in Africa, I've seen evidence that as much as 60% of state resources will go to the political elites, you see, and that is taking money away from what development needs. Also, there's a second element. Development needs private investment. And I don't see Africans themselves investing too much, except maybe in Nigeria. And what I see there is that the political parties look at the African private investor and say, if you're not part of our team, you're an enemy of power. See? So a lot of African money is outside the country. The World Bank has estimated something like $1 trillion. So what is needed is to persuade the Africans that do not divert resources, state resources, for political uses or private uses, and encourage local investors, because without local investors, you're not going to get development.
Yeah.
No,
Ambassador Williams, go ahead.
I agree fully with what Hank Cohen just said. And actually, you know, it's an interesting question, Mr. Butler, about the policy levers, because in some ways, the corruption, you know, not only do you have corruption in Africa and Asia, but guess what? You have corruption right here in the United States of America. But you also have a very large middle class in the United States of America. And so, although I don't think our corruption is kept down, there's just other things going on, so people don't focus on it as much. In Africa, there are fewer of those layers of society. So, and a lot of the resources are taken out of the country. So I'm not sure how our policy levers, how our policy stances can help that much. But I will say this: there is a new generation of Africans coming up. And one of the things that President Obama wanted to do, and at first I was not the biggest cheerleader for YALI, but there's an aspect of YALI that is quite provocative. Young Africans who have studied outside of their country and come back are often complain about the difficulty they have breaking through or bringing their new ideas back home. I've talked to a woman pharmacist trained in Morocco, went back to Niger, couldn't even really get through to open up her pharmacy. There was so much resistance, and there were traditionalists, her culture, the established economic class, the old boys club, so to speak, weren't really letting her in. But the idea that we are helping young people either with their education or helping them to make contacts even on the continent, in their region and with other counterparts in the United States, that will give them some kind of support, sometimes financial, sometimes just moral, to say, go ahead, you don't have to engage in the graft that the previous generation did. We'll support as you try to make this start up. We think this idea of a search panel or a search board on the internet is great, and we'll help you set that up. Those are things that that will be alternatives to the traditional way of doing things, and will sort of be an escape valve for some of that pressure. And in that way, it's an important lever, because these young people now are coming, they're making contacts and having access to resources and information that's not subject to that same kind of pressure. And so I think that's an important.
There's hope for the next generation.
There really is, and they're emerging now. I mean, they're on the scene now.
That's great. That's really great to hear. We have another question from one of our trustees, Ambassador Carl Eikenberry, and I think it's for all the ambassadors, but it's a conversation that I know that State Department and others in the U.S. government have been having, and it's how can state and USAID improve the professional education of and career incentives for diplomats and other development specialists focusing on Africa? I think not only that, but how can we get more people involved in the Foreign Service who would reflect on and make the Foreign Service look more like what the population of the U.S. And I don't know, I throw that out to any one of the three of you if you have any ideas for that.
Well, Susan, I think that actually those are two different questions.
They are two different questions.
Okay. I do think one is recruitment. I'm not a big proponent of the special programs that are only directed at people of color, but I do think we just have to be aggressive recruiters into the Foreign Service, and provide incentive and provide the kind of salary that would be commensurate, so that people want to join. But I think Ambassador Eikenberg asked a really important question, because a lot of our policy makers, our top echelon leaders, don't know that much about Africa to start with. And I find that in our service, we are the expertise is really dwindling. So the idea of providing incentives and getting people, involving NGOs, think tanks, and other people that have the ground expertise, the length of experience, I think that is going to be really, really important for the next generation of U.S. diplomats. So there have to be incentives for sharing information and acknowledging that State Department doesn't have everything. Therefore, maybe we're going to need to go to this university. We're going to need to find out and draw on the expertise that might be found at UCLA through their years of work in Cameroon on agriculture and farming and economic development in rural situations. I think that really is something that needs to be explored, and it needs to be better emphasized. But you got to do that by having the advisors to our main policy leaders recognize that all of the challenges that the United States is going to face in the future, that Europe is going to face, climate change, migration, urbanization, population boom, all those things are happening in Africa. And if we want to understand how to make these things positive for us as opposed to negative for us, we're going to have experts that study those things on the continent.
Well, and I think I added that little point about changing, because I think if we want to look at how we're going to attract not only people who are experts in the problems that the African continent faces, but I think we need to look at probably a restructuring of the whole way we recruit and train our diplomats, which I think is, because I know we're getting short on time, is a good program for us to look at, in the future. And I have another question, and I'll just kind of maybe end with this because we're right at the end of our program. But another one of our longtime members, Ephraim Isaac, asked about, and this is for Ambassador Cohen. We didn't mention specific countries, but could you give us just a short your thoughts on what's the situation in Ethiopia and where are they going today? And I apologize to the rest. We've got several more questions, but we've run out of time. So maybe we'll end on that. And Ambassador Cohen, do you have any thoughts on Ethiopia?
Ethiopia is a very large country with very diverse ethnic groups. And I think the traditional problem with Ethiopia is leaders who demand strong central control. This was true when the emperor was there, and this was true when the military was in control, and it's true now. The prime minister of Ethiopia is from the Oromia ethnic group, from the Oromia province. And what Ethiopia needs is a decentralized federal system so that every ethnic group can feel that they have self-determination within a greater federation. But this current prime minister has what I call the Menelik complex. Menelik was one of the first emperors who had tight central. He wants to control the government centrally, and these other ethnic groups don't like it. And so tensions are very strong, and I'm worried about growing violence there.
Well, and one final question we have from a good friend and colleague, Ambassador Pamela Spratland. She, and then maybe I put this out to all panelists and see if we can end on a bright note, because she mentioned that, what are some of the top reasons that, there are problems with government and sectarian and economic insecurity issues. And do any of you have any bright spots? I think Bisa, at least for me, had pointed out some bright spots in what's going on in the region, the Sahel and the region around Mali, but any other bright issues or things that you could tell us as we end the program?
Well, I would look at Angola. Angola, is wasting a lot of their oil money over the years. They have a president there named Lorenzo, who is bringing money back, putting people on trial, and really developing a good, and this is one of the major countries of Africa, one of the richest. So this gives me hope that this might be able to spread throughout Southern Africa.
That's great. Any short bright spots for Ambassador Thomas or Ambassador Williams?
For me, yes, West Africa. Despite its massive corruption that you see in Nigeria and Ghana, Nigeria is producing private sector businesses that are successful not only on the continent, but throughout the world. Mm-hmm. And they're unique to parts of Africa. They even have Nollywood, Nigerian films that are doing extremely well. So those are things, as well as internet businesses in Nigeria. Ghana and Nigeria compete for the most, along with Kenya, for the most students studying in the United States. And these are excellent students. Finally, in my time in Zimbabwe, I was proud that we had 6 Rhodes Scholars.
Wow, thank you.
In 3 years. The challenge is there's no place to go back on the continent for many of them to work until the private sector is developed. Right. So I leave it at that.
And Ambassador Williams, do you have any just short final bright spot comments?
Well, let's not forget about Cape Verde. No, since we have our huge diaspora community here. But no, I actually think that the potential, the promise in Africa is so great. It's almost unfair, even if you talk about a country that's having a big problem. Like even if we've really been jumping on Mali. Mali young people have so much potential, and there are all kinds of bright spots. One of the main spokespeople for even the civil society rebellion that's going on is a woman who was forceful, who's knowledgeable, who's a clear leader. I mean, so I think we have to be careful about that. The fact is, a lot of the corruption and sectarian strife was helped along by those countries' partners from overseas who were reaping benefits either through natural resources or other kinds of nefarious deals. And so this corruption or the setbacks that we've seen on the continent are not, yes, they are organic. Those countries are responsible for themselves, but I just have a problem with saying, well, can you identify one or two countries that we can at least be happy about? I think that the fact is, what is it, 2050, 1 out of every 4 people is going to be Nigerian or something like that. The population is huge. The populations on the continent are huge. The resources are amazing. And if we have a sensible foreign policy, the United States can have tremendous partners. Africans like Americans. Every kind of African can be found in our country. We can go to every single country on that continent and find a partner should we really decide to work with them. And I think we just have to look at it like that. Terrorism is a threat to the countries in Africa. They need our help. It's a threat to our country. We can work together. So hi, Pamela. She's an ambassador. She's been all over the place too. But I want to resist looking at it. I agree with the countries that we've already talked about, but
well, and I think you've made a good point, at least for us to end the program, is that if the U.S. Works well and makes the right policy decisions toward the countries of Africa, that we have a friend. And there's enormous potential. And yes, there's corruption all over the world, and there are problems with governance and with terrorism, unfortunately, in every corner of the world. But I think your note is positive. We don't have to just look at 1 or 2 examples, but if we play our cards right, we can have a great friends and allies on the African continent. So I want to leave it at that, and I want to thank all of you for, to me, a fascinating, discussion. And I also recommend to all of our viewers to buy Ambassador Cohen's book. I found it fascinating, and really, even for someone who tries to study history, I learned a lot about our policy and how we got to where we are today by looking at what we did in the past. So thanks to all of you, my friends, my colleagues, and I look forward to more discussions like this in the future. So thank you.